My daughter calls me a fake dad while my wife defends her and ignores the fact I pay for everything. Every time I try to teach her values, my wife says I exaggerate because her daddy spoils her without limits. Ever since I met Paula, I knew it wouldn't be a simple relationship. I don't say this because of her, who in many ways seemed to be exactly what I was looking for after years of failed relationships, but because of the context I was entering. A divorced woman, with a difficult teenage daughter and a biological father still too present, but only at the most convenient times. I was 35 years old and had stability built with effort, a solid career as an engineer, my own apartment, and the peace of mind of not owing anything to anyone. When Paula came into my life, I wasn't scared by the idea of raising a daughter who wasn't mine. On the contrary, I thought it could be an opportunity to build a family from maturity, from mutual understanding and respect. I never imagined that, with the passage of time, I would end up feeling like an intruder in my own home, like a stranger paying the bills in a scenario where everyone acted as if my opinion was worthless. Sophia, Paula's daughter, was 14 years old when I moved in with them. At first, she was cordial, though distant, a mix that I understood as normal resistance in a teenager still processing her parents' divorce. I never expected immediate affection nor demanded that she see me as a father figure. My intention wasn't to replace anyone, but to accompany her in her growth, help her in whatever way I could, be a reliable presence. I remained firm in my boundaries and patient in my attempts. During the first few months, we understood each other halfway. We shared occasional conversations at dinner, spontaneous jokes while washing dishes, or almost endearing moments watching a movie without her immediately locking herself in her room. But everything began to fracture with a phrase that appeared more frequently and violently as I tried to set minimal guidelines for living together. It was enough for me to ask her to turn off the television at a certain time or to wash her plate for her to, with eyes blazing with rage and arms crossed over her chest like a verbal shield, let loose. You are not my dad. My real dad gives me everything. That phrase, although seemingly simple, relentlessly eroded any foundation of authority or affection that I tried to build with her. It wasn't just what she said, but the conviction with which she spat it out, as if each word carried an emotional weight that I had no right to discuss. At first, I remained silent, hurt, but trying not to take it as a personal attack. However, when you have worked your whole life to earn respect in the place you occupy, you can't help but feel displaced when you are treated as an intruder, especially in the same space that you maintain, organize, and financially support. The most frustrating thing was that, instead of finding support in Paula, her reaction was almost always the same. A tense smile, a hand on my arm, and a condescending phrase like, "My love, don't take it so personally," or "Understand her, she's growing up, she'll get over it." I tried to explain to her, more than once and with all the calmness I could muster, that it wasn't a simple teenage tantrum, but an attitude that was becoming constant, destructive, and increasingly venomous. I told her that Sophia was learning to use that phrase as a weapon, as a barrier against any attempt of mine to guide or correct her. But Paula seemed incapable of seeing beyond her role as an indulgent mother. Instead of talking to her daughter, she used to justify her with arguments that, for me, made no sense. That Daniel, the biological father, overprotected her too much, that Sophia had been raised under a logic of emotional freedom, that any rule could seem like an attack to her. I, who grew up in a family where respect and responsibility were non-negotiable pillars, couldn't understand how I was expected to assume the role of provider, partner, and male role model without being given a single tool to actually do it. What poisoned me the most was seeing how Daniel would show up every so often, unannounced, with ridiculously expensive gifts, high-end cell phones, limited edition sneakers, even concert tickets or weekend resort stays. And then he would leave, leaving behind a daughter even more convinced that he was the true hero and I was just a nuisance. I was the one who was there every day, the one who resolved the overdue school payments, the one who did the grocery shopping, the one who got up at 5 a.m. to go to work and return with the intention of sharing a quiet dinner. But it was enough for me to remind Sophia that she should organize her room or help clean the bathroom that she also used, for her to yell at me that I was nobody to give her orders, that her dad never spoke to her like that he really understood her, and didn't bother her with nonsense. On more than one occasion, I suggested to Paula that we should act together, that if she didn't show a firm stance, Sophia would never see me as a figure worthy of respect. But her response, always evasive and tinged with guilt, was that she couldn't be too hard on her daughter because she was still dealing with the aftermath of the divorce. She assured me that she just needed time, that eventually she would accept my presence and understand my intention. But what Paula didn't want to see, or didn't dare to admit, is that this perfect dad her daughter idolized so much didn't even help with the most basic expenses. He didn't pay child support. He didn't contribute to the school uniform. He wasn't responsible for medical appointments or transportation. His only contribution was symbolic and showy, to appear every so often to shower Sophia with things, leave her sweet messages, and then vanish, while I was left as the ogre who demanded respect, order, and routine. Every time Sophia told me that her real dad gives her everything, I felt a mixture of humiliation and helplessness that I didn't know how to process. What was I supposed to do? Continue paying bills, maintaining the house, tolerating disrespect without anyone defending me or putting a stop to it? Should I accept that my role was that of an ATM with a heart, but without authority? I didn't expect Sophia to call me dad, but I did expect to be recognized as part of the household, as someone who was there to contribute, not to be treated as an intruder. The most painful thing of all was realizing that, deep down, Paula was more worried about not upsetting her daughter than about maintaining a healthy and balanced relationship. Because every time I dared to correct, to point out a fault, or simply to ask for respect, she ended up saying that I was exaggerating or that I should understand that she wasn't my daughter. In those words, which at first seemed harmless, I ended up discovering a truth that hurt me more than any teenage complaint. For Paula, I would always be one step below, even if I was the one holding up the entire structure. That was the point where I stopped feeling part of the household and started seeing it as a battlefield where, sooner or later, I would have to make a decision. Because no one can live for long in a place where they are made to feel invisible, much less when you know that the real conflict is not with a confused teenager, but with an emotional structure that refuses to change, even if it means crushing the only one who is trying to build something real. Update 1. A little over 4 months have passed since I wrote all of the above, and although I thought that things could find a balance with some time and mutual effort, reality ended up hitting me harder than I was willing to admit. Not only did nothing improve, but the tension at home became a permanent, invisible, and suffocating guest, present in every gesture, every trivial conversation, and every prolonged silence between meals. The atmosphere, which I previously tried to keep as harmonious as possible, became increasingly tense, almost unbreathable, as if my attempts to build a respectful coexistence were, at best, ignored, and at worst, attacked with a subtle but constant aggressiveness. During that time, I did everything I thought was right. I made an effort to be more patient, to moderate the tone of my words, to avoid unnecessary confrontations. I focused on showing Sophia that I wasn't her enemy, that she could count on me if she needed to. For example, I took her to a medical appointment when Paula couldn't leave work. I helped her print a school project when her printer stopped working, and I offered to explain some math topics that she was struggling with. I didn't do it expecting immediate gratitude, but because I genuinely wanted her to understand that my role in her life, although not biological, could be significant. However, all those gestures were systematically ignored. It was enough for me to make any observation about her behavior for her to react as if I were crossing a sacred line. She would tell me, with a mixture of contempt and irony, that her dad never spoke to her in that tone, that he did understand and support her, that I had no right to comment on anything that had to do with her life. What I found most difficult to assimilate were not Sophia's words, but the way in which Paula reacted, or rather, didn't react, to them. One Sunday afternoon, for example, Sophia threw her mud-caked shoes on the studio couch where I usually work. When I asked her to please clean them and not leave them there, she gave me that defiant look that was already familiar to me, and, without raising her voice, but with a chilling coldness, said that she didn't have to follow my rules, that her dad didn't set conditions for living with him. When Paula entered the room and I asked her if she planned to say anything to her, her only response was that it wasn't worth making a drama over some shoes. and that I should choose my battles better. In that instant, I understood that it wasn't about isolated battles, but a minefield where any attempt of mine to establish order was perceived as an attack. Little by little, I began to notice how everything that came from me was filtered through that damned phrase that Sophia repeated like a mantra. You are not my dad. It became a wild card to justify any fault, any disrespect, any disobedience. And every time she said it, she did so with more force, with more anger, as if she wanted to hurt me, as if she wanted to mark a distance impossible to shorten. It didn't matter how much I tried, how many times I tried to explain the reasons behind a rule or a correction. For her, I was nothing more than an imposter figure trying to occupy a place that already had an owner. One night, after a particularly uncomfortable dinner in which Sophia refused to clear her plate from the table, and then Paula did it without saying a single word, I decided to talk seriously with my wife. I sat next to her on the couch, hoping that the words wouldn't sound like reproach, but like a cry for help disguised as a conversation. I told her that I felt like the house was slipping out of my hands, that it hurt me to have become a shadow within the same space that I helped support. I talked about how I made an effort every day, not only financially but also emotionally, to build something real between the three of us, but that every step I took seemed to sink me deeper into foreign territory. I told her, with all the serenity I could muster, that I felt alone in this struggle, as if I were the only one trying to unite something that clearly had no intention of holding together. Paula's response was, as I feared, disappointing. She looked at me in silence for a few seconds, then caressed my hand tenderly and told me that she understood that I was exhausted, but that she couldn't force her daughter to accept something for which she wasn't ready. She repeated to me, once again, that Sophia was going through a complicated stage, that she still hadn't fully overcome the impact of her divorce from Daniel, that I should be more understanding, more patient. When I replied that patience has limits, that I can't live eternally waiting for Sophia to one day decide to respect me, she shrugged and said, in a low voice, that she didn't want to see me leave, but that she couldn't be too hard on her daughter either. She added that she wouldn't make her choose between her daughter and me, because that would be unfair to everyone. I don't know how to describe what I felt at that moment. It wasn't anger or sadness, but a kind of resignation that left me immobile. I understood, once and for all, that, for Paula, I would always be secondary in any conflict involving Sophia, that even if she silently acknowledged that what I said made sense, she would never openly admit it for fear of damaging the bond with her daughter. I left that conversation with the certainty that something had to change, because I couldn't continue being the invisible adult, the provider without a voice, the stranger who pays the bills but must ask permission to give an opinion. In the midst of that frustration, I started researching family therapy, not as a magic solution, but as the last resort I had left before considering more drastic measures. Fortunately, I found a therapist specializing in family dynamics with adolescents. I proposed to Paula that we attend a first session together, without clear expectations, just as an attempt to understand each other better. To my surprise, she accepted without much resistance, although she did so with a rather skeptical tone, as if it were another formality rather than a real decision for change. Now we are waiting for that first appointment. Honestly, I don't expect miracles, but I at least want someone external, with professional authority, to show Paula that what is happening in this house isn't simply a difficult stage or a teenage reaction, but a progressive deterioration of the bonds that, if not addressed in time, will end up destroying any possibility of coexistence. I'm exhausted, yes, but I haven't given up yet, although I feel it closer every day. Update 2. A little over a month has passed since the first family therapy session, and I must admit that, although I didn't have high expectations, what happened there exceeded even my worst fears. From the moment we entered the office, I knew it would be a tense experience. Paula, as usual, maintained that serene countenance that she so often used as a shield, while Sophia sat with her arms crossed and her gaze lost on the floor, clearly forced to be there, completely refusing to participate. I, for my part, felt worn out and with a bitter mix of anxiety and hope, as if I were walking a tightrope waiting for someone to finally say out loud everything I had been carrying silently for months. The therapist, a woman in her 40s, with a calm but firm tone of voice, began by asking general questions. She asked us to describe the dynamics at home, what roles we had, how decisions were made, and, above all, how we handled conflicts. I tried to explain, as objectively as possible, that I felt invisible in many ways, that although I was the one covering a large part of the household's financial responsibilities, I was rarely recognized as an integral part of the family. I talked about the recurring phrase that Sophia used to nullify any authority of mine, that damned sentence loaded with contempt. You're not my dad. And how? Every time I tried to set boundaries, I ended up being the one labeled as exaggerated or insensitive. Paula listened in silence, without interrupting, but with an expression on her face that I couldn't quite interpret. Sophia, meanwhile, maintained her indifferent attitude, fiddling with a bracelet on her wrist as if she didn't want to be in that place for another second. It was then that the therapist decided to speak directly to her. She asked her how she felt about my presence in her life, what she thought about the rules at home, and how she perceived the relationship between us. At first, Sophia just shrugged, saying that she didn't have much to say, but, after a little insistence, she dropped a bomb that left everyone, even the therapist herself, in complete silence. She said, in a dry tone and without blinking, that her dad had explained to her that I wasn't with her mom for love, but because I wanted to live well at Paula's expense. That, according to him, I acted important by paying for things to feel needed, when in reality I was only interested in material things, that her real father had warned her to be careful with me because men like me only pretend to be generous, but that, deep down, they are always expecting something in return. The therapist asked her if she really believed that, and Sophia replied that she did, that she trusted her dad more because he never lied to her. I didn't know what to say at that moment. It was as if I had been slapped without warning, as if all my efforts to build something were knocked down with a single blow. Not by Sophia, but by the invisible figure of a man who had decided to destroy my image from afar, manipulating his daughter with half-truths and accumulated resentments. I looked at Paula, expecting a reaction, a defense, even a denial, but she just remained silent, as if she didn't know how to process what she had just heard either. Finally, in a trembling voice, she said that she had no idea that Daniel was telling Sophia those things, that she never imagined that he would speak badly of me in that way. She tried to excuse herself by saying that maybe he was doing it out of jealousy, for not having gotten over their separation, but in her eyes, you could see the discomfort of someone who knows they have allowed too much for too long. The therapist intervened then, explaining that what Sophia was experiencing was a strong, divided loyalty, a typical confusion in teenagers who have grown up between two opposing paternal figures. She said that when one parent uses emotional manipulation as a tool to win the child's preference, the damage can be deep, not only in the relationship between the child and their family, but also in the way that child will relate to authority, trust, and affection in the long term. I can't explain exactly what I felt when I heard that, but, for the first time in months, I had the validation of someone external who put into concrete words what I had been feeling firsthand. After the session, the drive home was silent. Paula didn't say anything, and Sophia put on her headphones as soon as we got in the car. I drove with my teeth clenched and my mind saturated with thoughts. What resonated with me the most was the idea that, for Sophia, I was an opportunist, someone who was with her mother for convenience, not for love. I wondered where Daniel had gotten such an interpretation and why he felt the need to tell his daughter that. I understood then that the battle I thought I was fighting within my home actually had much larger and darker fronts. I wasn't only fighting against the rejection of a confused teenager, but also against the distorted image that her biological father was building from the shadows. During the following days, I tried to talk to Paula to delve deeper into what had happened, but she seemed to avoid the subject. She told me that she didn't want to pressure Sophia, that we needed to let the process run its course, that perhaps it was best not to touch the matter directly until the therapist guided us in a second session. I didn't share that idea. I felt that postponing things only allowed misinformation and manipulation to continue growing. I asked her if she had ever confronted Daniel about the way he interfered in raising their daughter, and she replied that she preferred not to get into conflicts with him because she feared that it could further distance him from Sophia or that he would start creating more legal problems. At that moment, I understood that what I considered an act of responsibility, setting boundaries, putting a stop to the manipulation, demanding respect, Paula perceived as an unnecessary risk that could jeopardize the delicate balance she was trying to maintain with her ex-partner. I began to feel like a second-class guest in my own home. I continued paying the bills, buying food, covering school and transportation expenses, but without the right to defend myself when attacked or to demand explanations when unfairly questioned. I felt trapped in a family structure in which everyone could speak, give opinions, and judge me, accept me. Helplessness turned into contained rage, into a daily frustration that accumulated in my chest like a stone that was increasingly difficult to ignore. I began to think, for the first time seriously, if it made sense to continue there, if it made sense to support a home where I wasn't allowed to fully be a part of it. The second session with the therapist is already scheduled, and although I know it's just the beginning of a long and complex process, I can't help but wonder if it will really do any good. Because if Paula isn't willing to set clear boundaries with Daniel, and if Sophia isn't ready to hear another version of the story other than that of her idealized father, then I don't know what space is left for me in this dynamic. The only thing I know for sure is that I'm no longer willing to be the easy target of an unfair narrative. Sooner or later, this story is going to take a turn, and although I don't yet know what form it will take, what I do know is that I will not continue to endure being denied the right to be part of a family that I am also helping to support. Update 3. Exactly 2 weeks have passed since that second therapy session. And although my initial intention was to remain calm and follow the specialist's instructions with discipline, the truth is that I began to perceive, with increasing discomfort, that no real progress was possible without addressing the root of the main problem. The absolute impunity with which Daniel continued to interfere from the outside, shaping his daughter's perception and manipulating the dynamics of a home that, ironically, he wasn't functionally a part of, but in which he exercised a disproportionate power emotionally. For a long time, his presence felt more like an elongated shadow that crept through every crack in the house, feeding misunderstandings, conflicts, and resentments that were never born within these walls, but arrived carried by the speeches Sophia brought back every time she talked to him. It was in those days that, after a series of inevitable reflections and several nights in which I couldn't fully fall asleep, I decided to carefully review the extent of my financial contributions to the house, not as an exercise in complaint, but as an urgent need to understand exactly to what extent I was supporting that family structure that denied me the most basic recognition. I opened my bank accounts, reviewed the monthly payments, went over the receipts, the transfers, the unforeseen expenses, and the commitments acquired from the moment I moved in with Paula. I made a detailed list of everything: tuition, school supplies, clothes, transportation, food, minor apartment repairs, utilities, even the birthday gifts I had bought for Sophia, trying, perhaps naively, to generate some kind of sincere rapprochement. The final sum hit me like a slap in the face. I was covering more than 70% of the total household expenses, and yet I was still being treated as an intruder without a voice or a vote. That discovery only deepened the discomfort I had already been dragging around, but it also served as a starting point for having a conversation with Paula that, until that moment, I had been postponing out of pure emotional exhaustion. One night, while Sophia was sleeping, or at least it seemed so, because she was locked in her room with headphones on, I sat down with Paula in the kitchen and, with the printed sheet of expenses in hand, explained that we needed to talk clearly, without beating around the bush. I showed her everything I had reviewed, each expense category, each figure backed by documents. I didn't do it out of anger, but out of the need to show her, with data, what I had already told her countless times with words, that I wasn't just a casual companion, but the main economic and logistical support of that family, even though I was never recognized as such. Paula didn't get upset, but her expression was one of bewilderment. Upon reviewing the papers, she was silent for several minutes and then acknowledged, almost in a whisper, that she had never stopped to think about how much I was taking on financially. She told me that, somehow, she had believed that by sharing expenses equally, everything was balanced, without considering that for months she had stopped contributing in several areas due to work issues, and that I had taken on everything without complaint. Then, When I asked her if Daniel had contributed anything since their legal separation, her answer puzzled me even more. There was no formal child support agreement established between them. Everything was handled by a verbal agreement that basically consisted of him buying things for Sophia when he could and however he wanted, without any kind of record or fixed responsibility. I asked her if she had ever considered suing him, or at least regularizing the situation through a court, and her reaction was as evasive as it was painful. She told me that she didn't want to do it because she wanted to maintain a peaceful relationship for Sophia's sake, and that she preferred to avoid the wear and tear of a legal conflict. That answer, far from calming me down, ignited an indignation in me that I was no longer willing to keep silent. I told her frankly that what she called keeping the peace was actually a form of capitulation that only benefited Daniel, and left at a complete disadvantage the one who, without being the biological father, took care of everything without recognition or support. I explained that the permissive and conciliatory attitude she had had for years with her ex-partner not only allowed him to continue interfering, but also fed Sophia's fantasy that her father was a perfect and unquestionable figure, while I was the stern guy who only appeared to impose rules and say no. I talked about the need to establish a minimal legal basis that would force Daniel to fulfill his duties as a father and make it clear, once and for all, that he couldn't continue playing the benefactor without assuming the real consequences of his actions. To my surprise, Paula wasn't completely closed off to the idea. She said that she hadn't considered it because she felt that Sophia's emotional stability was fragile, and she feared that a lawsuit against her father would trigger an even more negative reaction. But seeing the numbers in front of her and hearing me speak from exhaustion and not from anger, I think she understood something that, until now, she had preferred to ignore, that we couldn't continue building a family on the basis of silences, evasions, and such obvious injustice. She promised me that she would seriously consider starting the child support process, and that she would talk to a lawyer to learn about the legal options. It wasn't a firm commitment, but at least it was a start. However, while we were talking, I noticed that Sophia's bedroom door had been ajar. I didn't hear any noises or footsteps, but something in the air told me that we weren't as alone as we thought. I didn't pay attention to it at the time, but the next day my suspicion was confirmed. In the afternoon, when I got home from work, I found Sophia in the living room with eyes full of contained fury. As soon as she saw me come in, she threw at me the phrase that for months had been driving me to the brink of collapse. "You have no right to mess with my dad. He does love me, not like you, who are only here to control everything and pretend to be the savior." She said it with a different kind of rage, sharper, as if what she had heard the night before had reinforced in her mind the distorted version that Daniel had instilled in her. I tried to calmly reply, to tell her that no one was messing with her father for pleasure, but that it was about responsibilities, justice, family balance. But she wouldn't let me speak. She went to her room, slamming the door, leaving me with the echo of her words embedded in my chest. That night, as I went over everything that had happened, I understood that the road to stability would not be short or easy. But I also understood something much more important, that I could no longer passively wait for things to change on their own. If Daniel didn't assume his responsibility as a father, I wouldn't continue to support everything in silence either. The decision had already been made, although it hadn't yet been executed. If Paula didn't legally demand what was rightfully hers, then I would begin to withdraw, not out of pride, but out of dignity. Because no one, not even someone with a heart full of good intentions, deserves to carry the contempt of someone else's daughter while the biological father continues to play the hero from his unpunished pedestal. Update 4. Just a week after that tense conversation with Sophia, reality finally confirmed what I had suspected for a long time. It was no longer simply a rebellious teenager repeating borrowed words, but a complete structure, silent, ingrained, and comfortable for those who didn't bear the consequences, that sustained and protected the image of the ideal father, while throwing the entire weight of a house that I didn't feel was mine onto my shoulders. In those days, Paula and I continued talking, more and more frequently and less evasively, about the need to formalize the child support claim against Daniel. At first, she continued to show that mixture of discomfort and fear that was already familiar to me. But after insisting with concrete facts and arguments based on the law, she began to show signs of being willing to act, although not without hesitation. It was then that, through a contact at the city hall, an old university classmate who now worked in the family office, we were able to confirm that there was, in fact, no legal document that obliged Daniel to pay fixed child support for Sophia. The divorce with Paula had been amicable, without lawsuits or judges involved, with an informal agreement in which she, in her own words, preferred to avoid legal complications so that Sophia wouldn't suffer any more. Years later, the result of that choice was evident. Daniel appeared when he wanted, was absent without explanation, and used his position as a generous and selfless father to emotionally manipulate his daughter without having to take any real responsibility. When I showed Paula the report, the blank records, and the official confirmation that there was no court order, I saw her fall completely silent, as if she were just understanding the scope of the problem. She didn't try to justify herself or ask me to leave it alone. For the first time, she admitted that she had made a mistake by blindly trusting that Daniel would act of his own free will, that she underestimated the power that this absent and condescending figure could have over her daughter's mind. She told me that she never imagined that the lack of a legal document would cost her current partner, that is, me, so much emotional wear and tear, so much gratuitous contempt, and such a feeling of emptiness. We then agreed that it was time to act. It wasn't just about protecting ourselves financially, but about putting in writing a truth that was already evident. Daniel had to take care of his daughter, not only emotionally, but also structurally. He could no longer evade his responsibility under the excuse that he complied when he could. So we began the paperwork, and, with the advice of the lawyer who had already been helping me, a person of integrity, committed, and very clear about the procedures, we submitted the formal request to the Family Conciliation Office. A summons was sent to Daniel, with a specific date, to sit down and discuss what, by law, should have been resolved years ago. The news, as expected, didn't take long to detonate a storm. As soon as he received the summons, Daniel called Paula directly, and, according to what she told me later, the conversation was a mixture of shouting, veiled threats, and victimizing phrases. He complained, how dare she sue him after all he had done for Sophia, that it was an unforgivable betrayal, that she was only doing it because I had convinced her for financial gain, and that the only thing she would achieve was destroying the bond he had with his daughter. The most absurd part was when, at the end, he warned her that if she insisted on the legal process, he would withdraw from Sophia's life because he wasn't willing to be treated like a criminal. What we didn't know until a few hours later was that Sophia had overheard that call. Not all of it, but enough to form her own version of the conflict. Upon arriving from school, she locked herself in her room with a slam so violent that it made the door vibrate. Paula went upstairs to talk to her, but she couldn't get a single word out of her. I decided not to intervene, not out of indifference, but because I knew that any gesture of mine would be interpreted as a provocation. It was at night, after Paula fell asleep, that Sophia came down to the kitchen alone. She found me sitting there reviewing some work documents, and, without preamble, she threw a direct accusation at me that still resonates in my head today. She said that all of this was my fault, that because of me her dad no longer wanted to see her, that I was a selfish person who couldn't stand that she loved him more than me, and she finished with the phrase I already knew by heart, but that this time sounded different, more charged with venom. You are not my dad. You are only here to control us and destroy what little we had. I didn't respond immediately. I looked at her with a mixture of sadness and weariness, and I simply told her that her dad had every right to see her and continue in her life, but that he also had obligations that he couldn't continue evading. I told her that no one was taking anything away from her, that it wasn't a war for her affection, but a matter of justice. But she didn't listen to me. She left the kitchen with tears in her eyes and locked herself up again. It was at that moment that I understood that the wound Daniel had created with years of manipulation wasn't going to close overnight. Sophia was convinced that any attempt to set limits on her father was, by default, an attack against her. And yet, despite everything, we didn't back down. The appointment at the conciliation office went ahead, and Daniel attended, although with an arrogant and defensive attitude. The lawyer did his job with firmness and elegance, and a fixed monthly amount was established that he had to pay as child support, with precise dates, control mechanisms, and legal consequences in case of noncompliance. He signed it reluctantly, saying that he was doing it only out of obligation and not because he agreed with this circus mounted to squeeze him. But he signed it, and that, for now, was enough. On the way home, Paula and I didn't talk much. We both knew that the hardest part was yet to come. We had won a legal battle, yes, but what came next was rebuilding a family dynamic where Sophia could clearly see that the truth doesn't always come adorned with grand gestures or expensive gifts, that real responsibility, the kind that isn't seen, also matters, that being present every day, in good times and bad, shouldn't be punished or belittled, that you don't have to be the biological father to be in the right place. But that lesson, I knew, could only be learned with time and with actions. And I was determined to show her, even if it was the last thing I did for this family. Final update. 2 months have now passed since the legal agreement was signed that obligated Daniel to pay fixed child support for Sophia. And although it might seem that this resolution marked the end of the conflict, the truth is that it was just the beginning of a silent but irreversible transformation in the family dynamic. It wasn't an explosive victory or a moment of obvious glory. On the contrary, it was a slow process, almost imperceptible at first, in which each small change brought with it a chain of emotional consequences that, while they didn't solve everything, began to adjust a system that had been operating for years from imbalance and lies. The first tangible difference was noticeable in the frequency of gifts. For years, Daniel had made himself present in Sophia's life with exorbitant gifts that, although they didn't cover even a minimal part of her real needs, had a devastating emotional impact because of how they were perceived. From the moment he had to start allocating a specific part of his salary to child support, those details became less frequent and, over time, almost disappeared completely. Boxes with brand-name clothes no longer arrived every month, nor did new cell phones, just because. The impromptu hotel weekends and shopping trips were put on hold. And although, at first, Sophia reacted with discomfort, even with obvious disappointment, it didn't take long for her to begin to notice, even if it was with anger, that her perfect dad had limits, that not everything could be solved with a tender call or a package wrapped in shiny paper. It was then that something began to emerge that I hadn't seen in her since I joined this family: doubt. A question that she didn't ask me out loud, but that was noticeable in her attitude, in her longer gazes, in those moments of silence in which she seemed to be processing something that, until then, she had assumed as unquestionable. At first, that doubt manifested as an evident emotional distance. Sophia became more reserved, less reactive, as if she were mentally reorganizing the pieces of a puzzle she always believed was correctly assembled. She no longer yelled at me with the same contempt or resorted to the phrase, "You are not my dad," with the ease she previously used as a shield. Not because she suddenly recognized me as a father figure, but because she was beginning to understand, in her own way, that her reality wasn't as black and white as she had been led to believe. For my part, I decided not to take advantage of that fertile ground to impose myself or demand pending affections. I limited myself to being constant, to continuing to be present as I always had been, without imposing my presence, but without withdrawing either. I continued taking her to school if she needed it, helping her with her homework when she asked me, remaining available without making a big deal out of it. I didn't demand apologies or ask for explanations. I just showed her, with actions, again and again, that while others disappeared when things got complicated, I was still there, without disguises, without emotional seduction games, without promises I couldn't keep. With Paula, the relationship also changed. She was no longer that ambiguous figure who was afraid to set boundaries for fear of losing her daughter. Since the child support was formalized and she legally confronted Daniel, she began to take a more active and fair role within the house. She started correcting Sophia when she noticed rude attitudes, demanding small responsibilities that she previously let go, talking to her about the importance of recognizing what each person contributes beyond the biological bond. She also started to become more involved in everyday decisions, to worry about not burdening me with the entire weight of the household economy, and, most importantly, to defend me when necessary, not as an act of submission or as an obedient partner, but as a genuine form of justice. I won't deny that there were difficult moments in the midst of that process. On more than one occasion, Sophia emotionally broke down, questioned everything she thought she knew about her family, cried with a rage she didn't know where to direct. One afternoon, without warning, she approached me while I was reading in the living room and asked me, in a low voice, if everything her dad had told her about me was a lie. I didn't know what to answer her at first. I told her, with all the sincerity possible, that I wasn't here to compete with anyone or to occupy places that didn't belong to me, but that I did hope, with time, that she could see who was by her side even when there was nothing to gain. She didn't say anything else that night, but from that moment on, the distance that separated us became a little less cold. Perhaps the most ironic thing about all of this is that my revenge was never planned as such. It didn't consist of destroying anyone or imposing myself through conflict. It was, rather, a silent and calculated response to years of manipulation, contempt, and emotional exhaustion. And that revenge, however discreet it may have been, had a more powerful effect than any shouting or breakup. It revealed the truth, dismantled the myth of the perfect father who appeared with gifts but disappeared when it came to responsibilities. It exposed, in front of everyone's eyes, that the one who was there every day, facing the routine, solving problems, carrying the uncomfortable and invisible, wasn't the one who talked the most or promised the most. It was me. Today, the phrase, "you are not my dad," has disappeared from everyday vocabulary. Not because Sophia has adopted me as such, nor because our relationship is like a movie, but because she has finally understood that the figure of a father isn't always in the last name or in genetics. Sometimes it's in the shared silences, in the bills paid without complaint, in the advice offered without expecting immediate gratitude, in the doors that remain open even after having been slammed shut. My relationship with her isn't perfect, but it's real. And in this world, that's saying a lot. If I learned anything from all this, it's that sometimes the greatest act of justice isn't demanding what one deserves by shouting, but standing firm until reality itself stops supporting the lies of others. The truth, sooner or later, finds its way, and when it does, it doesn't need embellishments or speeches. It's enough for it to settle in the center of the house, silent but evident, as it always should have been.